week on Perspective, Venezuela's disintegration, a deepening crisis. Venezuela is collapsing. Its people are hungry, some starving, even dying from malnutrition. They are sick. Disease is spreading. Diphtheria, measles, malaria. What little there is to buy is exorbitantly priced. Inflation is on track to hit an unimaginable 51 million% this year. Last month, a 5-day power blackout ravaged what was left of an economy already crippled by sanctions, corruption, and mismanagement. For decades, the country has relied on its rich oil supply, but now, by some estimates, crude oil production could drop by as much as 60% this year. The country's aluminum and steel production is all but gone. Through it all, Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro has clung to power, blamed the U.S., blamed the media, and arrested journalists, and denied that his country needs help. As thousands of Venezuelans marched in the streets, Maduro cracked down, arresting and detaining hundreds, including children. That hasn't stopped the protests. Opposition leader Juan Guaido, now recognized as the country's interim president by more than 50 countries, continues to rally supporters, even as living conditions worsen. This past week, Human Rights Watch and the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health issued a report documenting the health crisis, urging the UN to step forward and formally declare a humanitarian emergency. U.S. Vice President Pence called on the UN to recognize a Guaido government and revoke the credentials of the Maduro regime.
With all due respect, Mr. Ambassador, you shouldn't be here. You should return to Venezuela and tell Nicolas Maduro that his time is up. It's time for him to go.
The ambassador smirked. Maduro called the request ridiculous. But at the same time, for the first time, Maduro acknowledged his country needs help and reached an agreement with the International Red Cross to allow some international aid. On the program this week, a look at both the humanitarian and political crisis in Venezuela and where things may go from here. We'll speak with one of the authors of the Human Rights Watch report and consider some of the international political influences at play. But we begin with freelance journalist Stefano Pozzebon. He has reported for several international news organizations, including CNN and RAI. He spoke to us from Caracas. The recent reports suggest that the health system is in utter collapse at this point. But we've seen this coming week by week, day by day, the spread of disease and malnutrition. How would you describe what life is like for Venezuelans today?
Yes, I think what you said is absolutely true. We're seeing this coming, and every time we have a little moment to step out of the story and try to reflect and make sense of what is happening in front of our eyes, you always think this can't go worse than what it is. And it always manages somehow to get worse. At the beginning, it was just like if you have a pre-existing condition, you won't be able to face, you won't be able to cure it. You won't be able to find any medicine for dealing with a chronic disease. Like if you have hypertension, for example, that type of medicine is impossible to find. It has been impossible to find at least since I moved here in 2016. And now it's getting worse and worse. The latest challenge is, for example, the electricity situation with multiple blackouts happening since March 8th, which is when the first big national blackout power outage hit Venezuela. And since that moment, most of the hospitals haven't been able to have a consistent amount of electricity actually. And that means that everything is becoming less and less reliable. Even the little oases of shelter, oases of functioning clinics, for example, we're talking about patients and the health situation. Even the little functioning clinics do face the fact that they don't have any electricity for maybe a week, for maybe several hours per day. It's a daily challenge, and people have to spend an increasing amount of time, an increasing amount of effort in trying to survive, looking for food, looking for medicines, trying to fix everyday problems, things that we out in the West give sort of for granted, and that most of the population here would give for granted because they were granted until maybe 5-6 years ago. And now the collapse has been been really impossible to stop.
We've all watched people come out at the protest rallies, and obviously a lot of the talk initially was about the politics and about Guaido. But when people protest now, what brings them when their personal living situation is so dire?
Of course, and that's the first reason why people take out onto the street. Most of the people don't take out. They almost surrender the dream of on seeing something change in the political situation, because nothing has changed in the last 20 years or so. But they won't see change in their living conditions. So you see people out, and I remember yesterday I was at a Guaido rally, and a person was out with a flag, not a flag, sorry,
a sign,
paper,
yeah,
saying a sign, exactly. I protest for water, electricity, studying, and a free Venezuela. So the first three reasons to protest are water, electricity, being able to study, and then there is the aspiration of a free Venezuela, free out of an increasingly authoritarian government. And that's also, it's remarkable with the news of today, when we see, for example, what happened this morning in Sudan. This has been on the radar here for the past 2 weeks or so. And yesterday, Guaido himself addressed it and said, we're seeing that in other places of the world, people are rising and people are putting their hopes on the line to try to remove what he called a dictator, so Bashir, the Sudan leader. And that happened in Sudan. What the difference here in Venezuela is that everything is so much difficult. Everything is so, it takes so long to happen, because people, for example, won't be able to protest as long as they don't have food. Or, for example, if they have water coming once every 2 days between 10 a.m. and 12 p.m., you bet they will try to stay at home and make the most of the water that they're given, rather than go out and protest. So that's why the living condition is so difficult.
You've also pointed out in your reporting that there is some kind of frustration growing within the opposition, that in fact there may be fewer people at the rallies. As you may have pointed out, one of the reasons they're staying home to try and get water or food. But what's this other source of their frustration?
Well, the frustration is the fact that this big gamble that Guaido has, Juan Guaido, the leader of the opposition, who swore himself in as president, as interim president of Venezuela on January 23, he addressed and embodied the hopes of so many people here in Venezuela, and that hope has so far not been answered, has not succeeded in ousting Nicolas Maduro yet. And that sort of big transitional government, that moment, that breakthrough that so many people have been looking for such a long time here in Venezuela, hasn't arrived yet. And that's a very, very familiar, frustrating situation for Venezuelans who have taken onto the streets in 2014, 2017. In 2017, the protests rocked here in Caracas for more than 3 months. 135 people were killed in clashes with security forces, and the world was watching. I remember those days when you really felt like, wow, this could be the time then. And then eventually nothing really happened. And by August 2017, Maduro was still very much in charge, and he went on to rule unchallenged for the rest of the year and for the whole of 2018. And I remember in those days, for example, people were watching the documentary Winter on Fire about the Ukrainian Orange Revolution and say, we should do that here. And now people are watching the events in Sudan and saying, we should do that here. Because we see around the world that when people take onto the streets, there is still hope and the possibility of causing a change in government. It just seems that is not happening in Venezuela, and that leads to more and more frustration.
It seems, though, too, that in some sense the political crisis has been superseded by the humanitarian crisis that the country is now facing. Maduro appeared to agree to some kind of agreement to perhaps let aid come into the country with the Red Cross. That's not happening yet. How realistic is it, do you think, based on your own experience, to expect that, and that it might actually even arrive soon?
Well, it could be arriving soon because also Maduro himself and his government have realized that it doesn't no longer pay off to keep denying the amount and the scale of the crisis, and at the same time that the longer the living conditions are so dire, they would they are the ones, their names are the ones on the line essentially, and people would link the fact that they don't have water with the leadership and the government of Nicolas Maduro. It's remarkable the fact that now Nicolas Maduro and his government are finally addressing the humanitarian crisis and calling it as it is, a humanitarian crisis. Because I remember many times you would go to a press conference here and ask the question about how can it be that the living conditions are so dire? How can it be that you as a government are not looking after the health situation or the situation in the hospitals? And you have government spokespeople telling you straight in the face that there is no humanitarian crisis happening in Venezuela. Finally, the government has changed its strategy because it realizes that it's not longer able to silence those who are saying that the humanitarian crisis is mounting here in Venezuela, and also they probably have something to earn in the political spectrum, in terms of their political capital by brokering the arrival of some humanitarian aid. And so that is a political capital that Nicolas Maduro wants to tap into by saying, I am the one that is trying its best to solve the humanitarian crisis.
Stefano, thank you very much for your insight.
Thank you.